Hello, welcome to Walk in the Word podcast. I'm your host, Al McMullen. This is episode 11 of my podcast, and the title of this episode is The Goodness of God. You know, all of us have experienced the goodness of God, whether we have been saved or not. In this episode, we will see how God favored a certain woman and really showered his goodness on her throughout most of her life. The text that I'll be using is from 2 Kings chapter 8, verses 1 through 6. And we will also be referring to 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 8 through 36. The biblical account of her doesn't reveal her name. She is identified simply as the Shunammite woman because she was from Shunem. But before we get into this episode, I just want to make a statement about the Bible. I've heard people tell me that they don't read or study the Old Testament because it's not relevant to us today, and that the New Testament is what we need to be studying and reading because it tells us the story of Jesus and the church. In response to that, if you are only studying and reading the New Testament, you are missing out on what the Bible is all about. The Bible as a whole is all about Jesus and his chosen people. From the beginning to the end of the Bible, we can see the beginning of creation to the fall of man into sin, and the beautiful redemption story of how God made a way through Jesus Christ to bring us back to our Creator and to make reconciliation for our sins. You know, the Old Testament prepares us for the New Testament. It's simply looking forward to Jesus as the only sacrifice that can forgive our sins and our only way to heaven. It puts together pieces that will help us to better understand the New Testament. If you study it carefully, you'll find wonderful nuggets of scriptures that reveal to us spiritual truths that we can apply to our lives today. For example, this is my third podcast episode from 2 Kings. Why? Well, because I keep finding these nuggets of spiritual applications that I want to share with you. I want to highly recommend to you to read and study the Bible from cover to cover. I like to read it this way in my daily Bible reading. When I finish the Bible, I simply start over again. You can thank me later. Now, let's get back to this episode. As an introduction to the text in chapter 8, let's first read the text in chapter 4, verses 8 through 37. This will help us to better understand chapter 8. Beginning there in that text says, one day Elijah went to Shunem. A prominent woman who lived there persuaded him to eat some food. So whenever he passed by, he stopped there to eat. Then she said to her husband, I know that the one who often passes by here is a holy man of God. So let's make a small, walled-in upper room and put a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp there for him. Whenever he comes, he can stay there. One day he came there and stopped at the upstairs room to lie down. He ordered his attendant, Gehazi, call this Shunammite woman. So he called her, and she stood before him. Then he said to Gehazi, say to her, look, you've gone to all this trouble for us. What can we do for you? Can we speak on your behalf to the king or to the commander of the army? She answered, I am living among my own people. So he asked, then what should be done for her? Gehazi answered, well, she has no son, and her husband is old. Call her, Elisha said. So Gehazi called her, and she stood in the doorway. Elijah said, at this time next year, you will have a son in your arms. Then she said, no, my lord, man of God, do not lie to your servant. The woman conceived and gave birth to a son at the same time the following year, as Elijah had promised her. The child grew, one day went out to his father and the harvesters. Suddenly he complained to his father, my head, my head. His father told his servant, carry him to his mother. So he picked him up and took him to his mother. The child sat on her lap until noon, and then died. She went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, shut him in, and left. She summoned her husband and said, please send me one of the servants and one of the donkeys, so I can hurry to the man of God and come back again. But he says, why go to him today? It's not a new moon or a Sabbath. She replied, it's all right. Then she saddled the donkey and said to her servant, go fast. Don't slow the pace for me, unless I tell you. So she came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. When the man of God saw her at a distance, he said to his attendant, Gehazi, look, there's the Shunammite woman. Run out to meet her and ask, are you all right? Is your husband all right? Is your son all right? And she answered, it is all right. When she came up to the man of God at the mountain, she clung to his feet. Gehazi came to push her away, but the man of God said, leave her alone. She is in severe anguish, and the Lord has hidden it from me. He hasn't told me. Then she said, did I ask my Lord for a son? Did I say, do not lie to me? So Elijah said to Gehazi, tuck your mantle under your belt, take my staff with you, and go. If you meet anyone, don't stop to greet him. And if a man greets you, don't answer him. Then place my staff on the boy's face. The boy's mother said to Elisha, as the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So he got up and followed her. Gehazi went ahead of them and placed the staff on the boy's face, but there was no sound or sign of life. So he went back to meet Elisha and told him. The boy didn't wake up. When Elisha got to the house, he discovered the boy lying on his bed. So he went in, closed the door behind the two of them, and prayed to the Lord. Then he went up and laid on the boy, put his mouth to mouth, eye to eye, hand to hand. While he bent over him, the boy's flesh became warm. Elisha got up, went into the house, and paced back and forth. Then he went up and bent down over him again. The boy sneezed seven times and opened his eyes. Elisha called to Gehazi and said, call the Shunammite woman. He called her, and she came. Then Elisha said, pick up your son. She came and fell at his feet and bowed to the ground. She picked up her son and left. Now that we have this information about the Shunammite woman, let's look at the text in chapter 8, verse 1 through 6. Elisha said to the woman whose son had been restored to life, get ready, you and your household, and go live as a resident alien whenever you can, for the Lord has announced a 7-year famine, and it has already come to the land. So the woman got ready and did what the man of God said. She and her household lived as resident aliens in the land of the Philistines for 7 years. When a woman returned from the land of the Philistines at the end of the 7 years, she went to appeal to the king for her house and field. The king had been speaking to Gehazi, the attendant of the man of God, saying, tell me all about the great things Elisha has done. While he was telling the king of how Elisha restored the dead son to life, the woman whose son he had restored to life came to appeal to the king for her house and field. So Gehazi said, my lord, the king, this is the woman, and this is the son Elisha restored to life. When the king asked the woman, she told him the story. So the king appointed a court official for her, saying, restore all that is hers, along with all the income from the field, from the day she left that country until now. When we put these two sections of scripture together, we can see that God really showered the woman from Shunem with his goodness. So the first question that comes to my mind is, why did God want to shower his goodness on this particular woman. You know, we all should want to be favored by God to the point where He will display His goodness in our lives. So this is the reason why I want to find out why God favored her. We can see the answer to this question in verses 8 through 10. In these verses, we see that she must have noticed something different about Elisha, because she persuaded him to eat some food, and as he passed through Shunem. It got to the point that every time Elisha passed through, he would stop at her house and eat. Then one day she said to her husband, I know that the one who often passes by here is a holy man of God. So let's make a small walled-in upper room, put a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp there for him. Whenever he comes, he can stay there. So now we see in these verses that she went from noticing that something was different about Elisha to being convinced that he was a man of God. Notice that she said to her husband, I know, showing that she had no doubt about who Elisha was. I believe that she had such a close relationship with God that God gave her the discernment to understand that he was a prophet. So as I thought about this, I realized that in today's times, we have a lot of false teachers that don't align with what the Bible teaches. And if we're not careful, we can be caught up in this type of teaching and be led astray. You know, this is why we should be reading and studying the Bible and growing in our walk with the Lord, so we can spot these teachings and avoid them. In other words, if we have a close walk with the Lord, He will give us discernment, just as He did with the Shunammite woman. Next, we see that one day while Elisha was staying there, he decided he wanted to do something for the woman, because she had gone to so much trouble to prepare him a room to stay in as he traveled through. He told his servant Gehazi, go and ask the Shunammite woman what he can do in return to compensate her for her generosity she had shown him. Her answer was, I am living among my own people. In other words, she was saying that she had everything she needed to live in comfort. She didn't help Elisha for anything in return. She did it to help the man of God do what God wanted him to do. In verse 8, we're told that she was a prominent woman. I believe that is because of the goodness of God on her life, because of her close walk with God. This is just another reason why we too should have a close walk with God. When Gehazi told Elisha what she said, Elisha asked him, what should be done for her? Gehazi replied, well, she has no son, and her husband is old. Why was this important? Well, I'm glad you asked. You see, in those days, it was important for a family to have a son, to keep the family name going, and they didn't have one, and it appeared they couldn't because her husband was old. We are not told why she couldn't have a son, probably because she had some type of physical ailment making it impossible to conceive. But Elisha told her that this time next year she would have a son in her arms. So here we go again, God showing his goodness to her because God blessed her with a son in her old age. This in itself is nothing but a miracle, and God showing favor on her life. Think about this. Have you ever thought that because of your relationship with God and his favor on you, that he could do a miracle for you? You know, maybe you're struggling with an illness, a drug addiction, or depression. God can heal you from anything you're facing today if it's his will. I believe that it helps to walk just as close to the Lord as we can, and when we do, he will bless us. In the following verses, we see that tragedy struck the Shunammite woman, as we are told that her son was suddenly struck with an illness that led to his death. Needless to say, the woman was crushed at the loss of her son. But she had faith that Elijah could help her. She laid her son on the bed she had prepared for Elisha and called a servant to quickly prepare a donkey to carry her to Elisha. Notice that when she got there, Elisha didn't know what had happened. She fell at his feet, and Gehazi came to push her away. But Elisha said to him, "Leave her alone. She is in anguish, and the Lord has hidden it from me. He has told me." The woman then said, "Did I ask my Lord for a son?" At that point, Elisha knew that something was wrong with the boy. Notice what the woman said to him. She said, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." In other words, she was not going to leave till Elisha went with her. I think she had that much faith that Elisha could bring him back to life, because it was a miracle from God that she had him start with. Let me pause here and ask you a question. Do you have enough faith in God to trust him with whatever you're dealing with right now? The Bible tells us that with God, nothing is impossible. Do you believe this? The Shunammite woman did, and God didn't let her down. We see in the next verses that God used Elisha to bring her son back. I just can't imagine how she must have felt as she saw that her son was alive. You know, I want this kind of faith in my life. I want to be able to trust God that he is in control, and whatever I'm facing right now, he can take care of it. I believe that the reason that God had favored this woman so much is because the relationship she had with him. It's apparent that she had all the faith she needed to let God work in her life. You know, God has blessed me so much in my life, but right now I'm going through some things that I have no control over. But I know who does. God does. And I know that whatever his will is, it will be for my good, because I am one of his children. Some days I do good, yet other days I fail God. But I know that he loves me and wants what's best for me. I believe this with all my heart. Do you believe this? The Shunammite woman did, and look what God did for her. We've seen in these verses the goodness of God on the Shunammite woman's life. As we get into chapter 8, we are going to see the greatness of God displayed. You know, sometimes we have to be reminded just how great God is, and I believe this is why we have these verses in chapter 8. Let me read them again. Elisha said to the woman whose son he had restored to life, "Get ready, you and your household, and go live as a resident alien wherever you can. For the Lord has announced a 7-year famine, and it has already come to the land." So the woman got ready and did what the man of God said. She and her household lived as resident aliens in the land of the Philistines for 7 years. When the woman returned from the land of the Philistines at the end of the 7 years, she went to appeal to the king for her house and field. The king had been speaking to Gehazi, the attendant of the man of God, saying, "Tell me all the great things Elisha has done." While he was telling the king how Elisha restored the dead son to life, the woman whose son he had restored to life came to appeal to the king for her house and field. So Gehazi said, "My lord the king, this is the woman, and this is the son Elisha restored to life." When the king asked the woman, she told him the story. So the king appointed a court official for her, saying, "Restore all that was hers, along with all the income from the field from the day she left the country until now." In these verses, we continue to see that the Lord is still showing favor to the Shunammite woman. But also, we see the greatness of God here too. Let me explain. God had told Elisha that he was bringing a famine to the land. God often uses something like a famine to chasten those who are disobedient to him and as a way of judging them for their sins. Elisha warned the woman to go and live in another country so she wouldn't be affected by the famine. Here again, we see God's favor on her life, and we see how she just immediately obeyed Elisha and did what he said. But also, we see that God controls nature. After all, God is the one who created this world, so surely he can control it. We see his control over nature all through the Bible, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. We're reminded how God told Noah that he was going to destroy mankind with the flood because of the evil of mankind. He saved Noah and his family by instructing him to build an ark so they would survive the flood. We can see today how that God can control nature by how, when a natural disaster comes, there are people who don't survive, yet there are people who are miraculously delivered. God protects those he wants, and to those who he doesn't, just as he provided a way for the Shunammite woman to survive the famine. Next, we see that God is in control over life and death. The miracles in the life of the Shunammite woman reveals the awesome power of God. She had no children, and her husband was now old. But the Lord gave them both new life, and the woman conceived a son. But the son was struck with an illness and died, yet the Lord raised him from the dead. Psalm 66:9 tells us, the Lord keeps us alive and does not allow our feet to slip. Job 12:10 says, for in him we live and move and have our being. God alone gives life and has power and authority to take it away, which is demonstrated in taking the boy's life and then restoring his life. We also see in these verses that God providentially controls events in our life. At the very moment Gehazi was describing this wonderful resurrection miracle, the mother of the child walked into the throne room. She had returned home only to discover that strangers had taken over her estate and robbed her of 7 years' produce. In those days, it was common for people to bring such problems directly to the king, and he would decide how property should be divided. The fact that Gehazi stood there as a witness to her ownership of the land made it easy for the king to pass judgments. Years before, when her son had died, little did she know that one day that bitter experience would play an important part in the preservation of her property. This is no coincidence. Only God in his providence can make something like this happen. So maybe the bitter experiences that we go through will someday play an important role in our lives. I know in my life, from some of my personal experience, that some of the things that I thought was terrible for me when I was experiencing them, I can now look back on them and see God was working them out for my favor. What an amazing reminder we have in these verses, that if we please God with our lives and grow in our relationship with him, we can experience the goodness of God, and also we can be sure that when we experience hardships in our life, God in his providence is working it out for our benefit, even though at the time we don't realize it. I believe that the things I'm going through right now, God is working them out in the background for my good. When we look at our troubles this way, we can take comfort and have peace that God knows exactly what he is doing. Well, this brings me to the end of this episode. I hope that you learned something or have been reminded of the goodness and greatness of God. I want you to know if you have any questions, comments, or thoughts about this podcast, you can contact me at walkinthewordpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like this podcast, you can click on the follow link to receive future content and as it's posted. So until next time, remember to walk in the Word every day. May God richly bless you.